Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Man. We're going to get started here. I have a lot to talk about and only so much time. I originally decided to do this talk a couple months ago. I was at, I want to say, B-side Salt Lake City, and I sat in on somebody giving a talk about Crypto 101, the history of cryptography, and as I'm sitting listening to this talk, it occurred to me, gee, I could give this talk. I've lived this talk. So that was sort of the origins of this talk. That's really just, it started out to be war stories about things I've done in my past. I hope I will be informative and educational, and I made the mistake of, in the abstract for GrrCON, saying I want to tie this into today and reality, and how does, classic cryptography apply in today's modern world. So I suspect I bit off more than I could chew today for 50 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. Thanks for coming. Hopefully we'll have time at the end for a few questions. I usually do talks with about 40 slides. I have 75 slides, I think, so I'm going to breeze through a lot of this stuff. Hyperdrive. Anyway, I'm Jeff Man. I am currently unaffiliated, but I'm classically trained as a cryptanalyst. I've been doing information security for quite a few years. That's my contact information. If at the end of the talk you feel like you want to get in touch with me, especially if you're working for a company that's hiring, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. A little bit of context, a little bit about me. This talk is really about me, and I'm not egotistical. It's just I've done some interesting things over the year, and as I've told people, I've had people say, hey, you should give a talk about this, so here we are. I've had 13 years of experience in my younger days, starting off with the Department of Defense. As I said, I was a certified cryptanalyst. This is a year of anniversaries for me. Just last month was the 30th anniversary of when I started at NSA, and it was the 20th anniversary of when I left NSA. So do the math, I was there for 10 years. I did commercial consulting for a few years after I got out of NSA. Back in the early days of internet security, the very beginning, where companies were getting onto the internet and you had to convince them why they needed a firewall and why they needed to think about security, and did that for a few years, and did something to offend the gods and ended up doing PCI. Got into that, and I was a QSA for 10 years. Any QSAs out there in the crowd that want to admit it? All right, don't hate me because I'm a QSA. I spent the last 3 years with a product vendor who I shall not name because they let me go a month ago. But you can look it up and probably figure it out if you want. And we'll move on. I'm also, anybody watch or listen to Security Weekly? It used to be called Paul.com. I'm a host on there. So you might see me online every once in a while if you watch that show. And I am, in fact, a Jedi Master. You have to Google that to find out why I say it. But if you've got stormtroopers around there, I think around you, you can sort of justify that claim. A little really brief history of cryptography, and I make the mistake of thinking that people know what I know about cryptography, and then I realize that people don't. I think everybody knows what the difference is between a code and a cipher. Anybody want to take a stab at it? There's a difference between a code and a cipher? Anyone? We'll get to that in a minute. I'll let you stew on it. But in terms of classic cryptography, which has been around for thousands of years, the whole idea is you have some information that you're trying to protect, that you want to keep secret, that you want to prevent a bad guy, an enemy, an adversary from reading or understanding the language or the data that you have to convey to other people. And in the classical sense of data security, there's three elements. You might have heard of these: the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA. Keeping secrets, cryptography is mostly involved with, classically, in a classical sense, with the confidentiality of data, keeping secrets. I mentioned that there's two basic types in terms of classic crypto systems: codes and ciphers. A code is primarily a system that's not designed so much for the confidentiality, but for brevity. In the old days, before there was computers, If you wanted to shorten a message, you'd use a code book, where you'd have a code book that might have words and phrases reduced to a symbol, word, or a series of numbers, something that basically made it quicker to communicate because you shortened the message. And a cipher, on the other hand, was taking the information that you had, the data, the characters, the words, and you're not changing them physically in terms of size, you're just doing something to scramble them. And then, of course, there's two types of what's called a cipher, either a transposition cipher, which is where you're just taking the letters that are there and scrambling them, moving them around, or there's a substitution cipher, where you're replacing the letters that are there with other letters, characters, numbers, symbols, whatever. Watch this. Oh, I'm not there yet. How classic ciphers are broken. I just put a few things up there. It has a lot to do with statistical analysis, analyzing the frequency of the words, the characters that you're seeing, that you're presented with. I brought with me some books from my personal collection that I was allowed to keep leaving NSA. One slide does not convey 2 volumes. This is Military Cryptanalytics Part 1. After we're done talking, if you want to come up and take a look at it, you can. This one is mostly manual cryptanalysis. This one gets into machine cryptography, things you've probably heard of if you watch the movies or are familiar with, history, the Enigma machine, things like that. Machine systems, manual systems. This is all manual cryptanalysis, how you break codes and ciphers. I don't have it memorized, but it's a great reference book. The thing about, and I'm just using English as an example, English language words, they have properties, and one of the most common ways in cryptanalysis is to just count the letters. In the English language, there are letters that are more frequent than others. I mean, you can intuitively think the letter Q isn't used that often, the letter Z isn't used that often, the letter J isn't used that often. The most common letter, if you look at the table, is the letter E. So when you're analyzing a cipher, when you have a bunch of scrambled letters and you don't know what you're looking at, the first thing you do is just count the letters and see how many there are. Watch this quickly. That was an example of a transposition system. Anybody know what that comes from? Please? Sneakers? Okay. If you don't, you should. This is from the Civil War, an example of probably what everybody is most familiar with in terms of cryptography is what's called a Caesar cipher. It's a simple substitution cipher where you're taking the alphabet and sliding it against itself. And so your substitution is some offset of the alphabet. The Caesar cipher, there's 26 letters in the alphabet. You can have 26 different positions. Obviously, one of those is going to give you back exactly what you started with. There's lots of variations and permutations on this very simple concept of substitution using something like a cipher wheel. I see there are a few older people in the audience that actually might remember newspapers and the funny pages and how very often there's little puzzles, crypto quizzes, and things like that. Those are examples of simple ciphers. The jumbled letters, where if you saw that, if you had intercepted that somehow, you'd have to start figuring out what it is you're looking at. So you count the letters and then you take it from there. The thing about substitution, though, is, on the left side is regular English. On the right is the count after you've looked at a cipher. You can see the spikes are still the same. They're just in a different order. So you can begin to figure out, what might be the, looks to me like it is probably Y. So you start substituting the letters back and guessing the high frequency letters until you start seeing patterns of words, words themselves. The crypto quizzes in the newspapers, they're always really easy because the letters preserve the actual word length, so you can get used to seeing sizes of words. There's only 2 one-letter words in the English language. What are they? A and I. All right, so if there's a single character, you start by guessing A or I, and you look for where it shows up in the position of other words. Like, there are words in the English language, obviously, that start with the letter A, and there's words that start with the letter I. And there's words that end with the letter A, but there are not many words that end with the letter I. So if you see, a single character and see it at the end of the word, try the A before you try the I, and chances are you're on the right track. So pattern recognition, it's what's in this book, because this was a manual process for many years. People wrote it down. So this book has a whole section that just shows patterns. When we saw a pattern, we would encode it. If you have a letter followed by another letter, an A and then a B, and there's a repeat, another B, and then a letter A again, we just call that the ABBA pattern. Well, this book contains hundreds of words that contain that pattern within the word, so it was just a lookup table at that point. Again, think you don't have a computer at your hand available to you. This is all a manual process. What changes things over the years is the introduction of key. What a key does to a substitution system, to a cipher, is, among other things, you're trying to eliminate or reduce the features that are inherently still there when you encrypt. So where those bars were there and you could still sort of make out what the letters probably are, the goal of key is to reduce that, to make the letters be more random and to lose that kind of profile. That means, in most cases, historically, that what you're dealing with is what's called a one-time pad. A one-time pad is a pad, literally of paper, maybe 50 pages, that have a series of random, could be letters, could be numbers, could be combinations, and it's random. It's the key. In modern terms, we call these certificates and key streams, but in the old days, it was random streams of characters that were actually printed out on paper. And the way it worked was both ends of the communication had the same one-time pad with the same letters on it. So it had to be repeated on either end. So the earliest form of key distribution is how do you get that one-time pad into the hands of both ends. And the other end very often was spies. It was very often people that were working, undercover from the other side, the adversary. Who might that be in the 80s? Think about it. There has to be a method of converting. You have a stream of random now, so you've introduced this new thing called a key that stands between your message, your plain text, and your cipher, what you want to transmit. So you have to have a consistent way that's known by both parties. It's not really important if anybody knows it, and it's not a secret, because the secret element is the random key. So what came to be used very often is what's called a visionnaire or vignette, if you're French, square, which is basically the alphabet with 26 different slides against itself in reverse order. And what this does, let me see if the laser thing works. Take your pick. It doesn't matter whether your axis is your plain text or your key. You connect, you pick your two letters, you connect it, and that's how you get your cipher. And it works the same in reverse. Oops. Give you an example. This is what a one-time pad might have looked like back in the day. So somebody would have to write out their message. In case you can't figure it out, it was very common to break it up into 5 or 6 characters, because humans can remember 5 or 6 characters. Because very often you either have to turn around and transmit these by Morse code or simply read them into a radio and transmit it. So you could do it in combination. So it was very common to break them up. But the message is enemy sighted on border. Stop. Stop is the way you say a period. Goes back to Morse code. Attack at dawn. Stop. And the way you would signal that you were at the end of the message so they could stop trying to decrypt, you just put a series of X's or Y's or Z's or something like that. So that's what the message would look like, and then you had to go through and do the substitution using the visionnaire square to come up with your cipher. Notice I didn't use the first 5 characters. That was the indicator of which page to use if you were receiving a message on the other end. It's just random characters, but it's the same 5 characters. So you flip through your pad and find the page that starts with those 5 characters. So when you're doing the decryption, you know where to start. So you receive the message, you write it out, you know you're on the right page, and you reverse the process, and you get back to the message. That's a one-time pad. It cannot be broken cryptographically. There is no way to break this system. It is perfect encryption. unbreakable. The only thing you can do is steal the key. Or if people are using it, if they use it more than one time, that's a problem. That's what the distribution looks like when you apply key. No longer can you tell that there's an E and an I because there are no spikes. And you can't even trust that the spikes that are there are more frequent letters. You've created random or pseudo-random, and you've hidden the characteristics of your message. It makes it a lot harder to break. And if it's truly a one-time pad, it is unbreakable cryptographically. So this is Tales from the Crypt. I was at NSA for 10 years, and I basically had 3 different major assignments. So I just want to tell some stories about my time at NSA. Well, I can flip through and see how we're doing on time. So I started out, as I said, as a cryptanalyst. I ultimately moved on to do what we called information system analyst work. I eventually got into penetration testing. I'll touch on that lightly. This is basically the kind of work I did over the 10 years that I was at NSA. And that's NSA, by the way. And in fact, the gray buildings are, I just read an article a couple months ago. They're fighting because they want to tear those buildings down, the gray ones on the right, and build something new. But some old timers are trying to fight it and consider these national landmarks and have them preserved. Has anybody ever seen the movie Enemy of the State? If you remember in Enemy of the State, there's a scene where the bad guy, the deputy director, is being driven in his limousine into the building, and it's that building there, and he's being driven in right around there, down a ramp underneath the building. Well, that's real. That exists. It's actually the ramp to the loading dock where they deliver, like food to the cafeteria and stuff. Most of the officers and directors at NSA just kind of walk in from the parking lot like everybody else. They get closer parking spaces. To put things in context, how many people know what that is? It's the Enigma machine. When I started working at NSA in September of 1986, it was still a secret that it was known that U.S. and the U.K. had broken the encryption, had figured out how to break the Enigma machine. Any ideas as to why that would still be a secret? Take a wild guess. Anyone? Say that again? No, that's a good guess, though. Anybody else have a guess? Still in use. There were still countries that were still using it because it was considered to be unbreakable, because it was machine cryptography. The number of combinations was such an astronomical number that they figured nobody could ever break the code or break the system. I was involved initially in what was called at the time the communications side or the information security side of the house. NSA historically is basically 2 sides. One that does the listening and the interception of communications, and one that would call that offense, and then InfoSec was the defense, designing crypto systems, designing communication systems with security and cryptography built into it. So I started out on the crypto side, on the InfoSec side, and I was actually assigned to the Office of Manual Crypto Systems. In the late 80s, they still had manual crypto systems. And one of the reasons why they hired me is they wanted to have a cryptanalyst, and they couldn't get anybody interested in doing it. So they sort of hired me and taught me cryptography at the same time I was doing it, because with the advent of machines in the 60s and 70s, paper systems had kind of fallen into neglect. Everybody kind of assumed that it was going to go away, and so nobody had looked at it. So they were sort of in a process of reinvigorating it, because they realized at some point there was this proliferation of paper. There was one-time pads everywhere, different types of systems that were being produced. The military, who was our primary customer, was using a lot of paper, and so we wanted to make sure that they were using the best, that the systems that they were using years before that had never been looked at again were still cryptographically robust. Not all one-time pads, but certainly that was a big part of it. This is where I get into slides. I'm just going to go quickly. These are some of the things that were used in the 60s and 70s and 80s in terms of communications by the military. That's a radio that's got a separate box that does the cryptography, the encryption. You can imagine those things had a pretty good amount of weight to it that had to be lugged around by, the radio guy, the communications guy. Another version, this was actually one of the first devices that actually tried digital. It would take an analog voice signal and digitize it, so it was voice transmission. This is a very common radio that was used. It didn't have the crypto itself, but it was a ruggedized, good radio that could be used in the field, especially in Vietnam. A lot of this stuff's the Vietnam era, but it continued to be used, and it had to have a crypto device connected to it. This is a device you can sort of make out that it looks like a telephone, and that thing sticking out the top is actually the key loader. That's where the electronic key was distributed to the users of this device, and they'd stick it in, and the key would get loaded in, and that's how that worked. I have that in there twice. Anybody remember this guy? Anybody know who this is? Real stupid little story, but when I went to work in the Manual Crypto Systems office, one of my assignments, because I was the new guy, was to become what's called the ComSec custodian. All the crypto, all the gear, the things that you just saw, had to be distributed from NSA out to the military, and it was done with very careful, strict processes in terms of physical controls, two-person control, two-person signatures, stuff being locked in safes and vaults. So there had to be a trail of who had access to this keying material, this cryptographic material, the whole way from in the whole distribution process. The ComSec account that I was responsible for, I was called a custodian, happened to be the account that was used by this guy, Ollie North, in the Iran-Contra affair. It wasn't me, it was my predecessor. Got a phone call from some guy at the White House that was a Marine colonel saying, hey, I need crypto gear, so he shipped it out to him. I was there during the investigation, and so I had to get involved in the investigation because I was the custodian for that very ComSec account. So I sort of have a connection to this guy. I won't say what I think about him. This is the kind of stuff that would be distributed. These are ways that you would get electronic key out to the machines, and they would get plugged in, like I showed you earlier, into the devices. We also put paper out there in the field, one-time pads, various varieties, various sizes. The spies that we worked with, they would literally get the little one-time pad that would hide in the heel of their shoe. They could somehow hide it. It's not, it was easier to hide, and it was also printed on rice paper, so their way of destroying it very often was eating it. In fact, one time we had a contract to produce these one-time pads and, got the rice paper, but somebody neglected to look at the ink that was being used. And we had a run of one-time pads one time where the ink apparently was toxic, so our spies were getting sick. We had to recall those. And this is not public knowledge because that's embarrassing, because this is, top secret. Other types of cryptographic materials, what's called authentication systems, where if you've ever seen the movies, I authenticate Echo Charlie, whatever, they're reading off these little cards where they have a predetermined method of somebody introduces a character set, which is really saying, where do you spin the wheel? And it gives you the answer back. And if you answer back with the right response, in theory, you're talking to the right person. So it does get a little bit into the integrity ends of things. That's important because, like in Vietnam, there were a lot of people working for the Viet Cong that were educated in America and could speak English and had negligible foreign accents, and they were calling in airstrikes onto U.S. troops. But people would do it because, well, the guy sounds American, he doesn't sound Vietnamese, so let's go for it. So authentication became an important thing. When I was there, we had these things called Stu 3 telephones. Horrible devices, but this was modern technology 25 years ago, and literally the crypto key was that thing on the right there that you had to stick into the phone and turn it, and that would load the key. And it was basically like a glorified walkie-talkie. It was half duplex, so you had to talk and then wait, and you sounded like Donald Duck on the other side, and people talking to you kind of sounded like Donald Duck, but it was digital encryption of a phone line. You guys having fun yet? This is my life. I feel like a dinosaur, like this is ancient history. I haven't even gotten to the computers yet, but I'm about to. One of my first assignments in this office was I was approached by a customer, and the customer happened to be a couple branches of the military, but starting with what was called DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. And they basically asked the question. They were using one-time pads. They were people that had been recruited in the field, which is what we call spies. And they were doing their communications with one-time pads. And they simply asked the question, I got this thing on my desk. It takes me hours to write these messages and decrypt these messages that I get from these people that I'm working with. Is there any way I can use this computer that's relatively new that's sitting on my desk? And so he kind of said, yeah, we should be able to do that. And this is revolutionary for NSA, because if you happen to catch the little phrase at the bottom there, I had a guy that was one of the senior executives within the group that I work for say there's no such thing as software. NSA only builds little black boxes. We only build hardware. Any code is embedded in these boxes. So this was a revolutionary idea. To my knowledge, I was the first one to field a software-based encryption system, and all we did was take the algorithm of the one-time pad and write a little computer program on it. And then we took the key that we generated that would usually be printed on the pad and put it on a floppy disk. And we had to do it in such a way that you could identify the pages, and we had to do it in such a way that the page could be permanently deleted when you were done using it, because you would use a page at a time. Even if the message was 4 characters long, you just use one page at a time, because you always had to have that first set of characters as your indicator. You didn't want people having to go through pages after pages looking for a matching character set. I was trying to follow requirements. If anybody's ever tried to do software development and follow a life cycle guide, we had that stuff written, but it was written for hardware. So I was sort of rewriting the rules as I went along. I was young, and I had a boss call me a loose cannon one time, which I took as a badge of honor. But one of the requirements was to use some sort of secure deletion routine, which are pretty commonplace these days with computers. There's all sorts of freeware versions. It's built into the various operating systems these days. But back then, I said, okay, I need to use a secure deletion algorithm. Where do I get one? Well, there weren't any, so we had to come up with something. So it was a big deal, but customer was happy. We came up with a program, and of course, this doesn't work as soon as you plug that computer into a network, because there was a strong belief that computers can't be trusted and they can't be secured. And 30 years later, they've been proven wrong, right? No, that's why we're here. So this only worked because it was a standalone system, and in fact, one of the arguments that was used against doing this was, but if a bad guy gets to that computer, they could get to the information and break the program. And my counter to that was, but they're using the word processing and all that on the computer anyway. All the information's already there in it wasn't Word back then, WordPerfect, WordStar. It's there in a text file. Why would you bother to go through the whole break the encryption thing when it's just sitting there in front of you? So they kind of shrugged and said, okay, you kind of met all the requirements and rules. Don't do this again, but we got to let you field it. So to my knowledge, this was the first and probably one of the few software-based crypto systems that NSA ever produced. Round of applause, please. And I've actually met somebody within the last year or two that actually had used it in the field. So I know it was out there and I know it was used. And he said, yeah, it was pretty cool. That followed very closely to a very similar project where I started working, this time the customer was Special Forces. They had sort of a similar thing where the Special Forces teams, the A teams, were going out into the field. And, if you're familiar at all with them, you've seen, all the thing with bin Laden and the Navy SEAL teams. Everybody's specially trained. There's a communications guy. Well, the communications guy in Special Forces, he has to carry a backpack with about 50 pounds of paper, because they used one-time pads at the time. And they used basically, it was sort of an early form of public key cryptography. They used one-way, one-time pads. So they had one set for receiving messages, and they had one set for sending messages. For whatever reason, they didn't use the same pad. Higher levels of security, I guess. But they had to lug around 40, 50 pounds of paper, and they would communicate with their Special Forces groups that are often deployed in areas where nobody knows they're there. They would broadcast messages to them sort of broadcasting over entire hemispheres with what they called supposedly a mobile base station. And the mobile base station, I tried to find a picture of it, and I really couldn't find a good representation. But they used a revolutionary process. Instead of a one-time pad, they used a one-time tape. And they used machines that would feed that tape, and they also had machines that would record a voice, somebody reading the characters or the message and converting it to punch tape, and then would have another machine that would take the two different sets of punch tape and run it together, that had the algorithm, the one-time pad function, that produced yet another tape that then they took and put into a machine that converted that, what it was reading into an artificial language voice. Let's say it was Polish or German or Russian, and then they would record that and broadcast it continuously 24/7. So on some frequency range in some hemisphere, there'd be some artificial language voice reading characters constantly. And the trick was the special forces groups had to know which time to listen, and that message was for them and it was real. So that was how they used one-time pads. Well, they were in a process of, and this, you can imagine all this equipment. You can see that's just one machine, and you can see sort of an illustration of how cramped it was. That's not the actual, but it's similar. It was two semis, two trailer trucks that was this mobile base station. And because it was all radio equipment and required antennas, the first time they set it up, they realized, we can't move this thing. So even though it was supposed to be mobile, it was on wheels. It was pretty much a permanent system. So along comes computers and a try to modernize. So they came up with this idea. Let me digress a minute. In working with special forces, they used the Visionaire Square, which they get a table and actually have a sample. I have that here. They would get this as the first page of every one of their one-time pads. It's the table. That actually turns out to be, and this was printed on the back, which you can't see, but come up afterwards, 23 unique three-letter combinations. They would memorize them, so they could do the encryption and decryption pretty quickly because they just memorized. It's always the same three letters. So if they saw two, there was a unique third letter, no matter what the order. I didn't, however, have it memorized, and in working with them, I'd just been through the history of crypto classes, and I'd learned about cipher wheels, and I thought there ought to be a way to make a cipher wheel that does the Visionaire thing to help me out. So I made one with graph paper, and I glued it to cardboard with rubber cement. Do they still make rubber cement? Does anybody know what rubber cement is? I used an acorn pin to pin it together, and I was using this wheel when I was at a Special Forces base, and the bastards stole it from me. So the next time I came back, I made a few more, and they kept, I would turn my back to write on a whiteboard, turn around, and it'd be gone, and they're all like 20 people in the room. So I finally said, do you guys like this thing? Would you like us to make them for you? So we made 15,000 of them. And here's one of the two prototypes. You can come up afterwards and see it. This is technically called an encryption ancillary aid, or an ancillary encryption aid. It has a designation like all those other things had letters and numbers. This has letters and numbers. And every time to this day that I see somebody I meet somebody and they say they're Special Forces, I ask them if they've ever remembered that thing. And they all do. They used it all the time. In fact, somebody somewhere along the line told me it came to be known, their nickname for it was the Whiz Wheel or the Whizzy Wheel. So if you ever meet somebody from Special Forces and ask them if they remember a Whizzy Wheel and they say yes, you can say, hey, I met the guy that invented it. That's me. Anyway, that's my little sidebar. Getting back to the Special Forces, the base station, and doing the one-time tape, they wanted to put the new base station into a bunch of transit cases using laptops and taking all that large equipment and shrinking it down into really short, easy, basic computer code. And with a little bit of radios and things like that, that's very obviously portable. And the key to doing that, again, was taking the one-time tape and turning it into a floppy disk. We were able to do that. It was revolutionary, and I don't know how long Special Forces used it, because they went on to do things like secure radios, and they actually have secure mobile telephones and things like that. But I actually ran into a guy that was retired Special Forces just a couple months ago, And he told me that even though they're using the secure radios, they don't trust them. They still use the one-time pads, which means they probably still use the whiz wheel. So that's a stupid little thing that I made at the very beginning of my career that Special Forces has been using for maybe 25 years. So I think that's kind of cool. Another round of applause. So my time came to an end in the crypto systems shop, but I was interested in cryptanalysis, so I joined an intern program. They had internal intern programs to try to get you all the diversity of experience to basically, climb the career ladder. So I became a cryptanalysis intern. I mostly went over to the other side of the house, the ops side. And I happened to be there. If anybody remembers, we had a small conflict in the desert back in the early 90s. Somebody's dad got involved over there, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So I was involved in the operations side of the house during Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Desert Shield was planning for the attack. Desert Storm was the actual attack. I was much busier during Desert Shield than Desert Storm because what's the first thing that you do when you start an attack? You take out the communications towers and the communications infrastructure. So whatever it was I was doing during Desert Shield, there wasn't a whole lot of it to do during Desert Storm. I'll leave it at that. I'll let you read that a second. This is an article that was in Wired magazine. I think it was back in 2013, and just let you read that a minute. And hopefully you're speed readers. But basically in the courtyard of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and it's an enclosed building, there's this crypto statue, and a bunch of interns went down there, and I can tell you we were kind of offended that this statue was at CIA because we were NSA, we were the crypto people, so we took it upon ourselves to try to break the message. So I can say with authority that I was one of those interns, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with the statue has carved letters in it, and it basically there's 4 messages. 3 of the 4 messages have been solved a long time ago, and that's what this article is about. Because the first article that Wired put out there early in 2013 said some guy at CIA had broken the code like in the late 90s, and then somehow they got wind of the fact that NSA had broken it years before. But I still have a copy of the letter. There was, the article is actually very factual because there was a memo that went out to everybody saying, okay, you can do this, but you have to do it on your time, and you can't use NSA resources. We had all sorts of supercomputers and things like that, big iron to do lots of statistical analysis, but we had to do it basically at lunchtime and on our own time. But it was solved pretty quickly. The 3 out of 4, the 4th message has never been broken. And I think the main problem is it's so short, it's hard to get enough of an idea of what's the underlying crypto system because there's just not a lot to work with. Anywho, my last tour as an intern, it was a series of diversity tours in different organizations, actually had me back on the InfoSec side of the house in an organization that was called Fielded Systems Evaluation, because somebody had the great idea that, gee, the way that we commonly break systems and codes and communications of our adversaries is we rely on the fact that they misuse it, they don't use the key properly, like a one-time pad key might get used for a week or a month because it looks like it's scrambled, so it must be okay. People, operators, they find bypasses, workarounds, anything to get the message through that doesn't necessarily follow the exact procedures that are specified in using these devices. And somebody thought, well, gee, if, we design the world's greatest crypto systems, but how do we know that our people are using them the way that they're designed? So that gave birth to the Fielded Systems Office, and this is actually a system that I evaluated. It's that one that was the early, voice encryption device. And I sort of found an attack. I had to write a paper. That was part of my cryptanalysis exercise, was to basically write a thesis paper, a research paper. I happened to do it on this device. That led to me having my final tour within NSA. The Fielded Systems Evaluation Office had a group that was looking at networked computer systems, and that was in the early 90s. And something happened in the early 90s. Mozilla something or other came out, and all of a sudden the internet became a thing. So we all decided to be cool and get into learning how to break into networks, and so we started to become pen testers and ethical hackers. And of course that was, there was a lot of popularity in that, and so the NSA formed what was called the Systems and Network Attack Center. So we were sort of founding members of the Systems Network Attack Center. And earlier this year, we wrote a paper basically that we wrote a paper that talked about how to break our own network and how to hack and get root on our own network, and we won an award, the group of us that did it. So I'm an award-winning pen tester from NSA. Don't applaud yet. Earlier this year, there's a book came out. Has anybody heard of this book or read this book? Dark Territory. I don't know if I can recommend it. It's probably interesting reading, and I don't know what the sources are that got this person to writing about this, but the secret history of cyberwar. Sounds kind of cool. Chapter 4, you'll notice, is entitled Eligible Receiver. One of my friends that was actually worked with me at the Systems and Network Attack Center emailed a bunch of this a couple months ago because he was reading the book, and he came to this page where this middle paragraph says, the NSA had a similar group called the Red Team. It was part of the Information Assurance Directorate, formerly called the Information Security Directorate, the defensive side of the NSA, stationed in Fan X, the building out near Friendship Airport. Does anybody know what Friendship Airport is? BWI, Baltimore Washington International. It's my home airport. During its most sensitive drills, the Red Team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed. Well, I'm here to tell you I was one of the founding members of an office called the Pit. There was 4 of us originally. We wrote that paper that I just showed you the award for. And this is the FanX complex. They spelled it wrong in the book. Those buildings there are right outside of the airport, BWI. And the Pit was actually in that building on the 2nd floor in that corner. And it was just an office, and it was just cubicles. But I don't know how they got the folklore that it's a super secret chamber, but applaud. It was kind of, there's obviously stories to tell about those days, but I'll save that for another talk that I'm tentatively calling More Tales from the Cryptanalyst. So look for conferences in 2017 and see if my name pops up. You might get to hear some stories about those days. So I've got like 5 minutes to try to wrap this up into how does this apply to modern times. Hopefully you picked up in some of my stories some things that still relate today in terms of hacking and computer security. Things like trust relationships, things like people not using things correctly or not knowing how things work, people breaking things inadvertently. How does cryptography show itself these days in the computer world? Passwords are a big thing. Being a cryptanalyst made it fun for cracking passwords for many years, especially in the early days. People tried to write their own random password generators. They never were. Yeah, they were always bad. Things like checksums and hashing, MD5s, MD1s, SHA, that's all cryptography. That all comes into play today. Obviously, secure web traffic, VPNs, that's where you mostly see encryption these days. And today it's all about speed and it's all about transparency. Can you imagine trying to load a website using a one-time pad? And yet there's vendors out there that are trying to use one-time pad concepts, the idea of one-time use key to do encryption even today. I saw a company a couple years ago at RSA, and I was just walking the floor, and somebody had a laser sitting there, and I'm like, laser? And they're saying, using lasers to generate random keys. So I had to stop and start talking to them. So they actually put that into a rack-mountable appliance, and they're generating key just based on, and I was talking to a physicist, so it got beyond me, but based on the entropy that the laser causes. That sounds pretty cool. I don't know if they're ever going to find a commercial application, but they're trying. Symmetric key and asymmetric key are the 2 most common key types of cryptography today. If you have to do the CISSP exam, you have to learn about this kind of stuff. I usually just try to break it down to there's something that you're trying to protect, you apply key to it using some fancy math, and you produce a cipher. And most people, that's good enough for them. Obviously, there's lots of different methods, there's lots of different algorithms, but essentially the key is the key today of encryption. And obviously with public key, it's a one-way thing, just kind of special, like special forces uses one-time pads, one-directional, unidirectional one-time pads. The sad fact, I say as a classically trained cryptanalyst, is there isn't actually a whole lot of cryptanalysis these days. It's all about brute force, and it's all about reducing the work effort to do brute force, which is pretty much still called cryptography and cryptanalysis today. But the game has been for many years, especially in computer-based cryptography, computer-based encryption. It's all about key size and brute forcing. How many passwords are there possible? How long does it take to crack them all? How long does it take to get the right key? Trying all possibilities. There's obviously a science and a field of trying to figure out ways around that, but that's an important thing, I think, to remember, is there isn't a whole lot of actual cryptographic attacks these days. There is the idea of key management, key distribution. When you're doing things in computers and you're generating the random key, that's the kind of thing that can get stolen and exploited. It's all about protecting the key. How's the key generated? Can you duplicate it? Can you replicate it? Can you steal it? That's the type of things that are cryptography today. But there's a legacy that's volumes long and hundreds of years of where cryptanalysis has come from. I'm right at the end of the time, but maybe I can take one or two questions if anybody has them. Otherwise, feel free to come up and look at my few toys. Yes? I can neither confirm nor deny that. No, I don't think I've heard of that, but not by name. Right. So, in the days, even when I was there, of, intercepting communications, the one of the first things is you got to figure out whether you're listening to an actual signal, a message, or if it's just noise. And I don't have the time to geek out on the way you do that, but it has something to do with what's called super random. Think of if you flip a coin 10 times, probability says you get 5 heads and 5 tails, but you rarely actually get that. You'll get 6, 4, 7, 3, 8, 2. And if you do that test 100 times and graph it, you're getting something that approaches the 50-50 probability, which is what's there. But real random is approaching actual random. It's not real random. So one of the tests for trying to figure out whether a signal was real or not, machine-made or man-made or not, was to see how random it was. And if it was too random, what we used to call super random, that's actually an indicator that it's man-made rather than just noise. So that relates, I think, to what you're talking about. That's probably it for my time. Oh, I'll take one more question. No, I don't. Maybe I do, but I don't have the time to get into it. Sorry about that. The time ran long. Very quickly, most of the slides, the pictures I got is from an online crypto museum called cryptomuseum.com. There's so much more than I had time to talk about. If you're ever in Maryland, you should go to the NSA Cryptologic Museum. You'll see a lot of this stuff. And a company called Online Business Systems. I don't work for them, but they sponsored me to be here today, so I just wanted to give them a quick shout out. You figure out what that says.